Hello, welcome back to AZH Wound Center, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm your humble correspondent for the Wound Care Window, Dr. Jeffrey Niezgoda. We got a very interesting and hopefully more personalized edition of the Wound Care Window today. I would like to introduce you to some folks, before we do our teaching, that are really behind the Wound Care Window. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Maxwell Larson. Max is the guru behind the editing camera. He takes the footage that we film here at AZH and he turns them into the just simply amazing and beautiful videos that you enjoy on a weekly basis. And standing right next to him is Samantha. Samantha is my right hand at WebCME. She runs the operations. In fact, she runs all of the things that we do at WebCME, and she's the person that you contact if you want any information about our courses. And the reason I want to introduce these two folks is not only are they amazing individuals and great team members of WebCME, but more importantly, they are the visionaries. They are the reason that we're doing the Wound Care Window. Sam and Max came up with this idea, and I think we have a lot to be thankful for. If you wouldn't have this concept, we wouldn't be doing these videos. Yeah. So Max had a little episode a couple weeks ago, and he thought this would make a great wound care window session. And so Max, why don't you tell us about why you're here?
So a few weeks ago I was moving into a new apartment, and I walked by a moving box that had our kitchen knives in it and caught my leg on the box with the kitchen knives. One was poking out the corner, and it sliced open my leg pretty good.
Ouch!
Yeah.
That must have hurt.
Yeah, wasn't too painful when I cut it open actually, but I went to the hospital, got it stitched up, and yeah, now we're here 2 weeks later and trying to get the sutures removed.
Well, Max, again, great idea. We are looking at the wound as it appears here today, and we're going to do a little education. Again, as wound care practitioners, oftentimes we're called upon to do other things than wound care, and suture removal is one of the services that we certainly provide in collaboration with our surgical colleagues. Many times we'll do this service for them when the patients follow up in the wound care clinic, and so we're going to show you how to do that. But I also want to talk a little bit about wounds and wound closure themselves. There are three basic terms for wound closures in the surgical realm. The first is primary closure, and that is exactly what we see here with Max. Max sustained an acute laceration, and that was closed primarily, almost immediately, with surgical sutures. As you see here, the skin edges are approximated and the healing takes place rather rapidly. You can see these sutures are intact. They're starting to get a little bit of inflammation around each one of the suture sites, but what you'll notice is that those wound margins have come together very nicely, and it's well healed, well approximated. So I don't know who did this, Max, but we have to give them a compliment. This is a very nice job. The second type of tissue closure is what we do in the wound care clinic on a daily basis, and that is secondary intent healing, where the wound is left granulated on its own. Many times this is the approach when we have these chronic ulcers that are large and can't be approximated surgically because the paucity of tissue, and so these fill in by granulating and eventually close through epithelialization. The last and third surgical term that clinicians need to be aware of is tertiary intent closure or healing, and that is a combined approach where we clean the wound up initially with some good wound care efforts, allow it to granulate, and once it's granulated, the edges are approximated with a surgical type of technique. There's a lot of devices out there that bring those wound edges together, but this is called tertiary closure, or oftentimes referred to as delayed primary closure. So those are the terms that we'll talk about today, and now let's show you how to get sutures out. So I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit because I got a lot of sutures here, and so we're going to do sort of a time-lapse photography. Maybe Max can show us some magic on how quick I can actually take these sutures out. But essentially what we're going to do is you grab, now the surgeon that put these in left nice long tails, and we're going to grab one of those tails, and I think he did this for two reasons. Number one, so that it facilitated the removal, But number two, you can see it's hard to see these sutures through all this hair on this guy's leg. My God. Anyhow, so you grab the suture, you mobilize it slightly, you take the scissors underneath and you snip, and you take that out, and you put in a little pile. And we're going to save those sutures, Max. Talk about that in a second. Again, mobilizing. And so sequentially we're going to go through and remove each one of them. Now, sometimes we're taking out these sutures, we'll take out every other one. If the wound is not healed as well as this one, we take out every other suture and then come back a few days later and take out the rest. But here, this is so well healed, we're going to just take them all out. So when we have a laceration like that that's well healed, many times that's all we need to do is take out the suture. But I'm going to show you one last thing that oftentimes is helpful. And this serves several purposes. If you take the sutures out early and you're worried about separation, you can reinforce the tissue and give it a little bit more strength by putting on some steri-strips. Steri-strips are material like this, you see. And what we're going to do is we're going to prep the sides of the wound with a little benzoin. Benzoin is a product that makes the skin really sticky. You really don't want to get the benzoin on the wound, but you want to put some benzoin paint on either side, either margin of the wound. And you want to let the benzoin dry. The benzoin has to be dry before you put on the steri-strips. We then cut the steri-strips to the appropriate size. We certainly don't need steri-strips that are as long as this. These ones will be just fine. Take those steri-strips off one at a time. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take and bridge the wound a little bit. That gives the wound some support. So even though the sutures are out, the steri-strips will give it a little bit more strength. And again, this is good for giving ourselves a little reassurance that we're not going to have a problem with separation of the wound. The other thing that steri-strips have been shown to do is actually help with scar reduction. If you take the stresses off that tissue, the scar that forms tends to be a little better. And Max, these can stay on for a couple of days. They'll start to curl up on the edges. You can trim the edges, and then eventually they'll just come off. You can shower with this just fine, so don't worry about being protective.
Okay.
So the other reason we brought Sam in here is she's a suture counter. Sam, how many sutures were there?
14.
14 sutures. Now, Max, the question I have for you is, do you want to take these home?
Can I put them under my pillow?
You can, absolutely.
Right.
And anticipation of who?
The suture fairy.
The suture fairy, why of course. The suture fairy, I hear, is paying very well for sutures. Thanks again for joining us on another edition of the Wound Care Window. I'd certainly like to thank my colleagues, Max and Sam, for participating in this video. Hopefully you enjoyed some faces behind the Wound Care Window. They do a great job, and send them some love notes. They really like your correspondence. So again, we'll see you next time on another edition of the Wound Care Window.